Welcome to our next video, which will provide some helpful background information about the book of Ezra-Nehemiah, which was originally written as one work to challenge God's people to rebuild. This is part of a Bible reading plan with Anthem Church, and today's video is from a discussion that I led a few years ago and is edited to provide you with the essential content to help you better understand what is going on in these important chapters. So let's get started. Now, to kind of bring this together as we enter now towards the end of exile and the return of God's people from Babylon, this is just to kind of look at how this fits together. Notice how Esther, that we read last time and talked about, that happened at 479, right in the middle. And you can see that was actually happening during a time that was with Ezra-Nehemiah, where they're doing their work largely towards the end of Nehemiah. But that's happening simultaneously, and it really shows how there's God's work happening multiple places through multiple people to protect and provide for God's people. Now, as we go back to the beginning here of this timeline, you can see at 438, this edict from Cyrus, we learned of that in Ezra 1. That's also the culmination of the 70 years. So to highlight that God isn't just punishing them flippantly, it's a consequence of their actions, and there's an end. And it's also towards the end of Daniel's life. So as we read Daniel, that's about when his life is towards the end. And so from that point, though, you can see that God's people, they return. And then from that point to Haggai, that's about 20 or so years. And so that kind of that's depicted in the part of Ezra 1 to chapter 4 that we read. And then at that point, they face opposition. God's people face opposition, and Haggai comes on the stage, speaks to them, and in 4 years' time, the temple is completed. And then we read about that in Ezra 5 and 6. Now, fast forward about 60 years, and Ezra comes on the scene. And then about 14 years later we are introduced to Nehemiah rebuilding the wall. But together in chapter 8, that's a really key moment in Nehemiah, where Ezra and Nehemiah work together to bring renewal. And as they're trying to bring renewal, you'll see how it doesn't have an effect. And unfortunately, when we come to Nehemiah 13, which is about the time that Malachi is addressing God's people as well, it's really a discouraging time. And so this kind of shows us a summary look at how these different stories fit together and kind of the themes that overlap. Originally, Ezra-Nehemiah was one unified work by a single author, and it opens about 50 years after the Babylonian exile, when the Israelites returned or started to return in waves to rebuild the temple, the walls of Jerusalem, and then to reinstitute worship based on the Torah. And so the story really focuses on three leaders. Zerubbabel, he's the grandson of Jehoiakim, who Jehoiakim, if you remember, sat at the Babylonian table at the end of 2 Kings. And so there's Zerubbabel, he's a governor, he's not a king here. Then you have Ezra, who's really working on the renewal of God's people, and then Nehemiah, who rebuilt the wall and helped Ezra with the renewal as well. He was a governor. And so these three leaders, who all began their story with the king of Persia, and the king of Persia was prompted by God to send them to rebuild. Each leader, though, must overcome opposition. So you'll see that at the end of each of their kind of story in Ezra 1 through 6, and then you see that in Ezra 7 to 10, 1 to 7, 8 to 12, and then 13. There's always this kind of opposition and an anticlimactic conclusion. And so let's jump in through this structure. You can see in the map just a little bit of where they're coming from in Babylon and maybe Susa. And so let's start, though, with chapter 1 to 6. I'll just summarize these. I know that we looked at key parts of this, but I want us to see the whole book, and then we can talk about the parts that we read. And so we looked at chapter 1 to 6. It's about rebuilding the temple. This is the story of Zerubbabel. It begins with a decree by Cyrus, who's moved by God, and that's amazing when you think of that, how God is working through Cyrus to send Zerubbabel
to rebuild the temple. Now, the author references the promise by Jeremiah in chapter 25 that we looked at, that one day the exiles would return to Jerusalem, triggering their hope that even more prophetic promises will be fulfilled. And so the reader follows Zerubbabel, who leads a group to resettle Jerusalem, to rebuild the altar, to make sacrifices, and then the temple as well. The ceremony for laying the temple foundation and the dedication of the temple reminds the reader of past stories of the tabernacle and the temple dedication. You see that in Leviticus 9, 1 Kings 8. And why that's significant is this is the moment when a cloud of fire should descend upon the temple for God to dwell with his people, but it does not. And so that's what's missing. And while most are happy, the elders who witnessed the old temple cry out in grief because this new temple is nothing like the glorious past and does not make them hope for a glorious future. They offer to help with the temple rebuilding, and Zerubbabel refuses. And so, this is at the end with the opposition. So just backing up, the grandchildren of the Israelites, they remained in Jerusalem. They never went into exile. So they're the ones offering help for the temple rebuilding. And so when Zerubbabel refuses, this is a strange moment when the message of the prophets is that all the tribes would come together and along with all the nations to worship God together. So that's a bit of a challenging moment in the story of Ezra as we get started. So now, as we look at Ezra 7 to 10, we didn't read this, but this is Ezra coming on the scene 60 years later. He's a Torah scholar, and he's a teacher among the exiles in Babylon, and Artaxerxes appoints him to lead another group to bring spiritual and social renewal to Jerusalem. And so with hope starting to grow, Ezra returns to learn that many recently returned exiles married pagans living around Jerusalem. And so he appeals to the law, the commands of Deuteronomy 23, 1 to 4 specifically. And it's concerned that Israel, who is to be holy, has become corrupted by those living around Jerusalem. It's really to become this distinct people and to focus on building this culture that God envisions for them. And so this is a challenge that we see in Ezra's day. That was a challenge earlier with God's people, just as the ancient Canaanites were to their ancestors, the Jewish ancestors, when that was an issue earlier. It's still an issue today. And so Ezra offers this prayer of repentance, and then in this strange decision rallies the leaders to enact a divorce decree that annuls these marriages and sends the women and children away. Now, God never commanded Ezra to do this, but he was led by his leaders to do this. And according to the prophet Malachi, who also cares about purity, we will read that God is opposed to divorce. And so with the decree only partially carried out, the story ends again with another anticlimactic conclusion. And so as we come now to Nehemiah, chapters 1 through 7, the story of Nehemiah begins with him serving in the Babylonian government when he hears of the ruined state of Jerusalem's walls. He prays, and then he gets permission from the king to rebuild. And the king sends him with an armed escort and resources to carry out this vision to rebuild the wall of Jerusalem. And Nehemiah does it with integrity and courage, but at the same time, he also provokes those living around Jerusalem to hostility. And so the strange aspect to the story comes if you read Zechariah chapter 2, verses 1 to 13. And he prophesied that the new Jerusalem of God's kingdom would be a city without walls, with God's presence surrounding it and welcoming the people from all the nations to join his covenant people. So there's just a bit of a question that is created as a result of what Zechariah said. Now, we didn't cover this section. We jumped in at this key turning point in chapter 8 and this call to return to the law. And so this is one of two contrasting stories. The first is in chapters 8 to 12, and we see Ezra and Nehemiah combine forces to bring about spiritual renewal. We read how the God's people read the Torah for days. They celebrated God's faithfulness in the past. They confessed sins. They renewed their vow to follow the Torah. And so it really creates this question, like, is this the turning point? Is this the moment that we've been waiting for? And then when we get to chapter 13, it's unfortunately about regression. Nehemiah is gone, And then when he comes back, he tours the city and he sees how the people are not following their covenant vows. And so the work of the three leaders is being undone. And you see these moments, there's a difficult part where Nehemiah goes on a rampage, but he's really seeking the Lord through that. So there's a lot of emotion in this chapter, and rightfully so, because of all that has been leading up to this. And so Nehemiah closes asking God to remember how he tried his best. And so as we conclude Ezra-Nehemiah, even though the Israelite people returned to rebuild their lives in Jerusalem, their spiritual condition is unchanged from before the exile. And so while the leaders try to bring change through political, religious, and social reforms, God's people need a holistic transformation of their heart if they're going to love and obey God. And so that's emphasizing what we read from Deuteronomy, from Jeremiah, and now we see it in Ezra and Nehemiah. There needs to be a holistic transformation of the heart. And so the book ends in disappointment, forcing us to keep reading to see how God fulfills his prophetic promises.